looking through, clause by clause, the old sports adage, you take it one game at a time. And that's the way to approach accreditation is one clause at a time. You look through there and it says, we do this. Do we do this? And if you don't do it, you need to change your evil ways. You start doing it, and then you've got a policy and procedure and everything to do it.
Welcome to Behind the Screens, conversations with background screening pros. I'm Les Rosen, your host, and I'm excited to have you here. On this podcast, we chat with the people who know the background screening world inside and out. Executives, industry experts, legal pros, and more. We dive into their personal stories and insights to give you a real look at what's happening behind the scenes. Whether you work in the screening industry or are just curious, Behind the Screens bring you the real, unfiltered conversations from the people who make it all happen. Stick around for stories you won't hear anywhere else. And ladies and gentlemen, Les Rosen here, and welcome to another exciting episode of Behind the Screens. I guess to play off of Behind the Scenes, but Behind the Screens of the background screening industry with conversations with background screening pros. And today we have a special guest, a longtime friend, a longtime accomplice. We've done a lot together, and I think I can say this without insulting anyone, a person who has not aged at all, and I've known him forever. He must have a picture in his upstairs attic of him that's aging, but I give you today a portrait of Mr. Derek Hinton.
What
Derek,
do you want?
welcome to the program.
What do you want with that introduction?
There you go. Was that worth the $20 you paid me? Was that okay? Okay, great. All right. Introductions for sale. Yep, I work cheap. All right. All right. Derek, you and I talked before the program. You started in the industry in 1984. In 1984, I had not even heard of the background screening industry. I was a prosecutor, a deputy DA trying murder and robbery cases. It'd be another 10, 15 years before I even heard of the industry, and you were already doing great things in it. So let's start at where you're at now. Tell us what your current role, what you do, what you like about it, and tell us about that, and then we'll go back from there.
Well, I'm owner and president of CRA Zoom. I help companies, CRAs, get PBSA accredited. I do some virtual or fractional compliance for companies. Got some human trafficking compliance packages. Latest thing is I'm managing partner of Name Grades. It's a service that allows CRAs to determine the commonality of a name so that they can do due diligence if there's on John Smith. And it basically, by going census data over the decades, tells how common that name is by the year of birth and state and provide them a score.
That's a lot to unpack. So let's start with first things first. I think we've all heard of CRA Zoom, which has been, I think, a tremendous contribution to the industry. Why don't you tell us about that, how it started and what you do?
Oh, I was doing another business, and some of my friends were at a PBSA meeting, sitting around as usual, PBSA, probably in a bar, and they got thinking this accreditation program has been around for 3 years, and we've got 19 companies accredited. Why is that? I mean, that's not going to work. And well, it takes 3,500 man hours to do. So, some of these people, the Julie Hackmans and the John Closes especially, came back and said, you ought to do this. You ought to go out and spend 6 months at a company and get them accredited, all of this stuff. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And finally hit me, that's not what I had to do. So I went through the whole standard, wrote it, and it's not that they couldn't do it. They just don't have the time to do it. And it's better, and it's not a cheat. I mean, these CRAs, thank me after they get accredited. And I say, well, this is quite a gig. I tell you what to do, but you do all the work and then you thank me, so it's not, they have to do it. So it's not a cheat. It's not a Cliff's Notes. They have to do the procedures, they've got to.
Right. And it's not as much the time. It's just, where do you start? Because my old firm was in that group of 19, and you look at those accreditation standards, and you have nothing to start with. You start with a blank page. It's like, it's overwhelming. Your eyes glaze over.
Yeah, that's what I thought when they said you ought to do this. One,
Yeah.
looking at him, I got a headache. No,
Well, how many firms have you helped get accredited?
I don't, there's about, what is there, about 140 now? The majority of those have been clients.
Oh, that's fantastic. So obviously, what you provide is not a work avoidance. They still have to do the work, and they have to
Yeah.
put the hours in, and they have to think it through, and all the advantages of accreditation. But you give them a head start. They're not looking at an empty page. You give them something, a template to start from.
Yeah, it's a template and it goes through every clause, and the clause says you must do this, but then it doesn't stop there. You can't say, well, yeah, I do that next. You've got to do this, and then you have to have a policy and procedure, and then you have to have something, an employee handbook stipulation, or you have to have, your agreements have to be this. And so what I provide is all the written material so that it's already there. And so for them, it's a matter of, I got to do this, but it's already written. It's ready to,
Right.
It's ready to turn in.
So a person goes to CRA Zoom, they get your package, they get your time, they get your assistance, they can then get to work and become accredited.
Yeah. I mean, it's there. It's a matter of looking through, clause by clause, the old sports adage, you take it one game at a time. And that's the way to approach accreditation is one clause at a time. You look through there and it says, we do this. Do we do this? And if you don't do it, you need to change your evil ways. You start doing it, and then you've got a policy and procedure and everything to do it.
And then you have to audit and make sure that your people know you're doing it, and then you have to show it, be able to show it to an auditor. And if your people are asked about it, they need to know how to explain it. Okay, that's great. And the number of firms that got accredited, I think, is so important because when accreditation was limited to a few, there wasn't as much value. But now, I think now the pendulum has shifted so that so many employers say that's just part of the the cost of doing business. I mean, that's just kind of a starting point. Well, are you accredited? And
It's the evolution. It used to be on RFPs. Are you a member of NAPBS? Yes, we are. Okay, great. Go on. And now then the knockout question is not, are you a member? It's, are you accredited by the PBSA? And, if you're not on an RFP, it can be a knockout.
Yeah. Okay. So you do all this work with accreditation, and you helped all these firms. You also mentioned you do a couple other things. I love your name match. That's been out for a while. So you can try to show accuracy by the statistical probability of having a computer twin based upon name and age, particularly when you have a common name, right?
Yeah, I mean, the CFPB says you need an algorithm. You shouldn't just depend on your worker discretion in some of their consent orders. And they say, be careful of common names. And you think they tell you what common names are? Do they provide a list? Well, of course not.
No.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny, some of the names, common is not the same thing as well-known. And so you have names like, just to pick a few, Roosevelt, Trump, Biden. Everybody knows those names. Those are well-known, but they're very rare. And the opposite is also true.
Oh, that's interesting. And the mere fact that you have there's no rule or law or case that says within this statistical certainty is a match, but it's one more piece of evidence you can use. And
you looked to see how common that name was.
Oh, that's okay. And the other thing you said you did, and now it escapes me because I'm suffering, as I mentioned on another
Just a fractional compliance officer.
Oh, right, exactly. Okay. And so they get a fraction of you?
They get about 20 pounds. Yeah.
But at any given time, they get all of you during the fractional time they have you.
That's right. That's right. That's a better way to put it.
All right. I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've been doing this since 1984. Tell us a little bit about that, your career path to get from 1984 to where you are today.
Well, I graduated college, and we'd been transferred and didn't live around my grandparents very much in my life. And I thought, before I get a real job, I'm going to go and stay with my grandparents for a couple of weeks, and visit them. Manford, little tiny town in Oklahoma outside of Tulsa. And while I was there, boy, this really ages me, but I saw an ad in a paper for a computerized information service. I think I just read Megatrends, which was an old book. And so I got my grandma's manual typewriter, and I happened to have a resume, sent in a letter to a Tulsa company, and got hired. It was DAC Services, DAC, 10th person to start working there. It was turned into USIS. It's now HireRight. And their claim to fame was having you didn't call them laptops, you called them notebooks. A notebook computer, it had the program on the micro cassette tape. And their claim to fame at the beginning was really computerized or MVRs, driving records, 48 hours. That was outstanding, So,
wow. That was revolutionary at the time.
yeah, they order this, otherwise you're a trucking company or an insurance company underwriting, and you send a letter off to the DMV, and it comes back 2 weeks later, if you're lucky. And that guy that you hired is out in the middle of the country with a truckload of color TVs, and he's got a DUI, and you got to tell him to just leave the truck there. So, this was get it in 48 hours, had communications with every DMV, or soon developed it after 84. And, you got to leave your dot matrix printer on, the CRA does, or the insurance company or the trucking company, and we call them when the phone rates are low and print out driving records after they've ordered it 2 days ago.
Oh, that's amazing. And I think you mentioned before we started, but Charlie Dees started.
Charles Dees, he was the person who started the company. He stayed in it until the 90s, but I kind of think of him as, there was Equifax was doing this for the large insurance companies at the time, and Mike Sinke, Rapid Info wasn't far behind. But he was really the start with the computerized driving records for both insurance underwriting and truck driving, the big commercial carriers. And so he was way ahead of his time.
So DAC was the first of the driver dossiers, or the drivers. What would be the term?
Yeah, and that was really drive a check. Everybody says, what does DAC stand for? And it was really, the truck drivers at that time, would run over somebody, they'd quit, and then they'd go down the street to apply for another job, and they'd forget that they ever worked for that past company. Drivers just move. And so drive a check was a way for when a driver leaves your company, you fill out a little form, and we upload it. And when that driver goes down the street, you've got an employment history. DOT requires a employment history. It's not a matter of, and you got to ask these questions. Well, this is a way to do it, along with the driving records.
Wow. Well, it's a different world now, but it's fascinating to hear how it kind of started way back, way back when in the I wouldn't say Stone Age, but the dot matrix printer age. All right.
That's the way I started. It was telemarketer, phone sales, commission only, selling insurance, and then, next 20 or so years, marketing, compliance, communication, legal affairs, lobbying. Then I fired myself.
And then when you got there, Billy Lee was already there,
Billy
right?
Lee was there. I mean, the company had only been around since late 91, but so she's older than I am.
Okay. Well, I don't know about age, but she's been in the industry longer than you. All right. So what did you do after your stint there? I mean, and I know DAC went to USIS, as you said, and that eventually morphed into what we now know as Higher Right. But what was your next step along your journey?
Well, DAC was for trucking companies getting information on drivers. At that time, that was their thing. So in about 2003, actually, we were involved. That was my next step. You, Carl Ernst, Mike Sankey, the company DOT Job History. It was one of the early, self-screen and present credentials to a trucking company. So it was just kind of the reverse of that. And that went on for, 10 years or so. And then it was, CRA Zoom was next.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's right. I was sort of the silent partner in that one.
As much as we could make it that way.
Right. And so it's basically you, Mike, and Carl Ernst.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to talk more about Carl Ernst and Mike a little bit later. But so you did that for about 10 years or so, and then you moved into your current things.
That was 2000, and I guess CRA Zoom. Very start of 2012, late 2011.
Okay. We mentioned, maybe we'll do it now, you mentioned Carl Ernst, and some of the viewers here may not recognize the name, which is a shame because Carl was one of the very first, FCRA gurus, and he wasn't a lawyer, CPA, I think, but really got into it heavily. Well, you know the history better than me. Worked with Mike and started BRB Publications. So how did you and Carl?
He called me up out of the blue. Talk about FCRA. I mean, you talk about a nerd thing to I said, are you a product? No, I just want to talk, about the FCRA. And at the time he said, I'm going to call this guy Les Rosen. Well, good luck with that, but no. But yeah, he was brilliant. Him and Charles, I think, are the smart, got no offense, but I think is really smart guys in the industry. Carl really helped me in the beginning, and this was probably, early lessons, is that we were talking and I said something, oh man, that's a hairball. I don't want anything. He was like, no, Derek, that's where you go to. If something is really difficult or it's a mess, that's what you do. You go to those places to try and help companies. And it always, kind of stuck with me and it was probably just, left over from college, take the shortcut, that's a mess. I don't want to get involved,
Right.
And he was, like accreditation. So, that was some of his advice is you don't take any shortcuts or you don't try the easy route. If you find something that's really messy, really difficult, that, as I called it, a hairball, that's where you go.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, and a lot of .com companies have made money that way by you take a seemingly insolvable problem and you just hack it to death till you finally solve it.
Yeah. Of course, that was easy for Carl to do. I mean, he was smart. You were talking about his intelligence, or we've talked about that before. I mean, yeah, that's easy for him to say.
Yeah, he's probably one of the smartest guys I ever know. Carl was so smart, and he talked like Yoda, And so he would say something, and it was, well, what did he mean? It was almost like an oracle, and you didn't want to admit you didn't understand it. And if you asked him more about it, he probably, didn't really say much. And so you would sit there and ponder every word because you knew there was some genius behind it. Yeah. But even if it wasn't clear to you, you say, right? So what a smart guy and amazing. And he helped at the very beginning stages of any PBS. He was there at that first meeting. And I remember Carl saying, Les, do you have your non-compete statement? I said, well, no, because I don't know what that is. He said, well, when you have an association, you have to have some sort of statement that you're that you're not going to use this, anti-competitive and set prices and blah, blah, blah. So we wrote something out, and that's basically been what's been delivered every year since. So hey, what a great guy. So you also did a lot of work with Mike Sankey. He was part of that company we all put together. But where did you meet Mike?
Well, before that, one of the things, an early employee of DAC had created a little book, and it was the Guide to Background Investigations. How do you get MVRs? A city-county cross-reference. If you say you're in Manfred, Oklahoma, well, that's Creek County. And then you go to this Creek County. How do you get a criminal record from that county? What is there involved? I mean, there are 3,500 parish counties. And so he did that. And later he kind of sold it to the company. And somewhere in there, Mike, after selling Rapid Info, which was a driving record service, started BRB. And he had, I think, the MVR book. But he started with the source book. And so we were competitors. And I called him up one day and, said, this is Derek Hinton with, it's his background, Guide to Background Investigations. And he was, okay. What do you want?
That's Mike.
The source
okay.
book.
All right.
Okay. And so we worked out a deal where actually we cooperated on the data, helped each other out, which is a strange way to make a friend and a business partner by eventually, starting out as the only competitor. We were the only two games in town.
That's great. And then Mike had BRB Publication, and wasn't Carl a partner in that as well?
Yeah, Carl was the, you take all of this information out and find out, is it by mail, is it by phone, is it by both, what's the address? And he created forms, programming forms that would just plug it in and write the book. I mean, I don't think I ever did understand it.
Right. So speaking of writing the book, you're an accomplished author of one of the books that Mike sold at BRB, the Criminal Record Handbook, right?
Yeah, the Criminal Records Manual, I think it went through about 3 editions, started in 98, did another one, have to be updated by, states keep changing their laws and stuff. Most of it stayed the same, but the law changes. The very last, the third edition, I worked with Larry Henry, was co-author of it, who, speaking of one of the other old guys who I respect in the industry, but so yeah, that was, I think the last edition came out in 2002. And then it's
fantastic.
kind of, computerized and
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the first books on criminal records. I covered criminal records in the Safe Hiring Manual, but that was from the perspective of employers.
Right.
You went into it, 10 times deeper and much longer from the perspective of CRAs or people getting criminal records.
CRAs and employers, yeah. I mean, it was kind of both, probably short-shifted both.
Yeah. Right. And then you worked with Mike Janke at BRB, and then that's where
He was my publisher.
He was your publisher.
My publisher, not a friend.
He was my publisher too, and he, as good of friends as we were, he didn't pull any punches when I sent him a manuscript that he thought was crap.
I've seen some of your rough drafts.
They were rough.
He was a shit.
He said, "Les, you're my friend, but all right, let me have it." And said, "You can do better. Go back, redo it."
Right. You weren't exactly anal retentive about your typing.
Right. Well, typing is, I was before my time. I really needed a program I could speak into. So that brings us up to pretty much the present time. So during all of this various career roles that you've had, what's an early lesson you learned in your career that's sort of stuck with you?
Mainly just that one, probably that one from Carl, is you run to the difficult. You run to it, not away from it. And that was the opposite of my lazy thinking usually is, and this is probably really more for entrepreneurs, but if there's a mess out there, that's where you go. You don't avoid it or, that was the main one for me.
Oh, interesting. What do you enjoy most about the background screening industry? I mean, you're a smart guy. You could have gone anywhere. What kept you in background screening?
Are you okay?
All right.
Are you sure?
I'm sorry. Did you give me $20 to say that?
You don't need to put on airs here. Let's see here. Right now I dealt with a lot of truckers, and I dealt with a lot of big insurance companies in the DAC life. Truck drivers, I would say, and this is probably what everybody says, but the people in the CRA industry, and, especially the entrepreneurs, guys like yourself, with ESR, you come up and you make an idea work and you build a business. And, I don't know how many PhDs you have or that are out there, but just smart people who are entrepreneurs and trying to do the right thing. I just enjoy the small businesses.
Oh, that's interesting. See, I like the David versus Goliath story, and Goliath not being a particular person, but Goliath just being the galaxy of forces that are opposing you and things you need to conquer.
Yeah. So more so than the big corporate entities at an insurance company, certainly more than the Washington, D.C., I can say it, Department of Transportation or the, FBI, all the, the government, the bureaucrats, the large companies. I mean, there's great people and everything, but that's not what who I enjoyed working with.
So given, your unique perspective in the industry, I mean, you've worked with, I don't know, at least over 100 background firms, very closely on accreditation, if not more. You've worked with DAC, USIS, and now HireRight. You've seen it all, done it all, basically. From your perspective, and we don't want to spend a lot of time here, but just top of mind, what are the biggest changes you've seen? And what does Derek Hinton think the biggest challenge might be going forward?
Well, one of the big changes is the low bar to entry to be a CRA. In the olden days, it used to be a matter of pride to take them through the mainframe computer room, got the raised floor, the air conditioning, the UPS, the big wall of modems, old, huge, refrigerator-sized computers, and you talk about it's got 15 gigabytes of storage. Well, heck, our phone has that now. So that took a lot of money to do. It took a lot of money to go to each DMV in the country to get driving records fast. You had to have a network to get criminal records by somehow going out, finding out where this county is, what cities belong to that. It was tough. And right now, I could go out and start a CRA. Well, I'm not a good example, but, my wife, my kid could go out and start a CRA next week. And it's
Right.
platforms. All the integration's already done with vendors. There's the billing, there's the ordering, there's the receiving. That you can't imagine how much time that took to try and program and figure all this stuff out, especially state differences. Well, now it's almost like CRA in a box.
Yeah.
And you can get that. The other thing that's, it's a lot more litigious than it used to be. It's not just, I've spent my fair share of time in depositions and courtrooms, but it's worse now. I think back in the 1990s, we had a criminal record database and we just reported reports. I had a, 613. Of course, we'd, send a matter off to the consumer, but we didn't verify everything. We had a database that we'd created and we reported that, and you certainly
Not
don't
anymore.
do that anymore.
It doesn't fly anymore.
No. So, I remember I had an old safety director. He was a paratrooper in World War II. He said, "Son, have you ever hear of in war they say, kill them all and let God sort them out?" Yeah, I've heard that. He said, "What I want you to do, that database, you send me everything and I'll sort it out." And that was the wrong thing to do, litigious wise or otherwise. That just the thing to do. But we didn't know, it says right there in the FCRA, you can either get the latest and greatest or you can notify the consumer if it's public record for employment purposes. So,
Right. And for those of you following at home, make sure you get out the FCRA and read Section 613. Then this conversation will make a lot more sense. And 607B on accuracy, but those were the old days. It's interesting though that you're right. There's practically no barriers to entry. Anyone and their cousin could be a CRA. But on the other end, even though you now have all the tools, and there's compliance tools, then what becomes the differentiator? You still got to go out and convince people to use you, as opposed to everyone else. So there's still a process. There might be easy entry, but there's not. I would think, just thinking out loud, they're not necessarily easy success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Don't get me wrong on that. It just always kind of makes me think, it's kind of funny. If I wanted to open a nail salon in Podunk, Oklahoma, I got to go get a license. If I want to open up a CRA dealing with credit reports and criminal records that may affect people's eligibility for employment or to have a house or you don't need a license. It just seems strange. And the database, we need to jump through hoops as a CRA. As a matter of fact, this one makes me think of you. One time you were showing me around, I think, San Francisco, and you'd been a defense attorney. And I asked you, Les, don't you the guy did it. Don't you hate defending him? Because I know you're good at it. Oh, yeah, I am good at it. But don't you hate that? And you said, no. Why not? And he said, because before anybody, whether it be a death penalty case or anything else, before the government does something, I want to make sure they jump through every hoop and make sure they do things exactly right. That's our protection. Right. You don't say, yeah, he did it, we're not going to, so that's always stuck with me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Wow. And here
you didn't know I listened to you, did you?
Yeah, I thought you ignored everything I said.
But that's always stuck with me, and that was one time you were right.
That's interesting. I love that. One of the names we mentioned, and worth just bring it up again, you mentioned Larry Henry.
Yeah.
And another good guy from Tulsa. And, I remember when Larry was really, the only FCRA attorney in the country. As far as I can remember, there was all these, right now we have so many law firms and they have FCRA sections and background screening sections. Back then, at the beginning of the industry, Larry was really it. He was, when all these really great attorneys we have now, lots before some of them were born or they were in elementary school, Larry was out there fighting the good fight.
Yeah, he was. The reason, he started when Charles Dees came and said, I need a there's some law, FCR something for credit. I'm not doing credit and I'm doing employment. It looks like there's things we got to do. I mean, we got to get permission, a permissible purpose, and there's stuff. I mean, it looks like we got to get certification that they're going to, get consent from the person. And so Larry wrote it. I mean, it wasn't like you don't have an off-the-shelf user agreement back then. I mean, he looked in the FCRA, okay, we're going to need this, we're going to need that, and wrote some of the first, what I would call CRA user agreement there was. There wasn't any sitting on a shelf.
Yeah. And I remember, hearing the story that Larry, Charlie Dees came to that Larry's firm and they said, "Hey, Larry, here's a case, here's a client. Why don't you handle it?" Okay. You kind of got into it accidentally. That's really interesting. And then Larry worked with you on your third edition.
Yes, of the Criminal Records Manual.
Yeah, exactly. And worked with Mike as well. So looking back at your career, involved with the CRA and background screening, I like to ask people, is there an accomplishment or achievement that stands out as something that you're proud of or most proud of or that still makes you smile? Or that,
it's gratifying when they get accredited. That's kind of a continuing. The criminal record book was kind of one of the first. I enjoyed the time with that first meeting of NAPBS when you were our, what would you say, titular head?
Yeah, right.
No, when you were a big driving force on that. And so that's, for NAPBS, that's kind of, have been a part of it.
Right.
That first meeting and kind of all for one and one for all.
Well, speaking of PBSA, I mean, we already talked about CRA Zoom and your role in helping so many firms get accredited. How has PBA impacted your career? What's been your involvement? What have you done? I mean, I don't do much anymore in terms of attending trade shows or things, but when I did attend, you were always there, right in the thick of things.
Yeah, obviously, no PBSA, no CRA Zoom right now.
Right.
But, the PBSA, it's important to all of us. I think in the short story, in the 1990s, we had a client, Vermouth DAC, we're selling them MVRs. I think it was a small insurance agent. And this sold it to somebody. And the state of Pennsylvania was doing a sting operation. It was political, like a lot of these things are, but it was after DPPA. So they cut us off, and they'd cut off Equifax. So here you had 3,000 trucking companies who couldn't get a driving record before they hired a driver. You had insurance companies that couldn't underwrite auto insurance. And so we spent some quality time in Harrisburg, trying to convince them. And it was kind of political. They were doing what they were cracking down on the bad guys. And they were killing their, trucking companies and insurance companies. So, that was late 90s. And we look around, well, who do we get help from here? There isn't no NAPBS. The credit, the big credit bureaus, they don't give a darn, Equifax had been cut off. And so, where Tom Ridge is the governor at that time, and we go try and talk to him, and he doesn't, this is below him, but it was a real bind. And I think the outcome, was eventually they'd broken, sunshine and meetings law, and we threatened to sue them, and then they opened it back up. But that was, vet your clients, make sure that they educate them. And that's where they are really, we've all got a voice. One little company from Tulsa, Oklahoma, going to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, we ain't got no carrot and we don't have a very big stick. As many trucking companies as want to sign a letter, American Trucking Associations, they're helping. But, PBSA, that's a great value to the industry.
Yeah, I had kind of the same experience in California. They passed, I think it was called AB 655, and somebody just changed all the background screening laws without consulting anybody. I called up the office of the state senator and talked to the chief of staff who was in charge. And I said who I was. And by the way, you're trying to do something good here, but do you have any idea of the secondary unintended impact? He said,
No.
Well, yeah, I had no idea, but you sound reasonable. Why don't you come over, let's meet, rewrite it. And so I basically rewrote the California law and
Is that the kind of the FCRA, the
of California.
Yeah.
Yeah, and basically, there's that. They say if you don't want to look at the kitchen and see how the sausage is made. You don't want to know how laws are made. But for example, every CRA in a report, because of California, has to have some sort of disclaimer statement.
Yes.
That this, whatever it is now, and that law had passed one with some horrible language. So I said we need to rewrite it. And so Stan said, "Well, what do you want it to say?" And I just made something up. And that language I just made up on the spot is the language we all still use today. So it's amazing the power of being in the right time in the right place. But there was no organization. There was no resource. I just happened to be able to get my nose in there and rewrite the California law. But without the value of PBSA, so I think that's a great answer. That the value of PBSA is we have a voice, we have a presence.
Yeah, I want to talk. Larry, he was helping us when the FCRA changed, and they were going to. You'll see the. You have to have a written disclosure and authorization unless it's Secretary of Transportation, and then it can be by phone, by mail. And that was the main thing we were working on because at truck stops, mail service is really bad for applying for a job. This was before. And, that was what we were working on. But Larry was really on to the criminal records at that time. All convictions were cut off at 7 years. And I think he is the main person in the industry that got that prohibition of reporting older than 7-year convictions lifted for employment purposes.
Right.
He helped change the FCRA in that.
Yeah. And there's other people involved too from DAC, but Larry was certainly,
Yeah, he was our attorney. But, that was a bigger hot button for him than it was for DAC. And, so I think of him as the father of longer than 7-year
rule. Right. That's And it's so funny. So the FCRA still has basically the DAC truck driver exception to the permissible purpose rule and consent rules and so forth. But with the internet age now, it's not necessary. But that's still there. It's a vestige from the past. This whole exception to the written consent rule. If you're a truck driver, right? Just because you might hire a truck driver at the time, might be hired at a gas station over a payphone. So
there's.
All right. Boy, the world has really changed. So anyway, I think we've exhausted you in the topic of background screening and the FCRA, and it was fun talking about all these things you've done in the past and all the things you're still doing, particularly with CRA Zoom. But let's leave the wild, wonderful, wacky world of background screening, and let's get to life beyond background screening. And some people tell me that exists. What's your hobbies? What do you do? What's your interest outside of screening? What do you do for fun?
Well, art museums and the ballet, philosophy classes.
Observing or doing?
I was waiting. You actually let me talk. I was waiting for you to say, come on. No, it's a lot more lowbrow than that. We got a place at lake out in the boondocks. You'd say redneck country, the lake, so we spend a lot of time there, boating, sea-doing, clearing brush, your highbrow stuff.
So I remember being out in Tulsa a long time ago, visiting you. I was looking for office space potentially for a call center and going out with you and Becky, your wife, and your 2 kids. And it was to a Mexican restaurant, which was really quite good. Near some waterway, and your kids at the time were, just little kids. What are they doing now?
Let's see. My son's chemical engineering, works for Phillips 66.
Wow.
In Bartlesville, kind of half-time Tulsa, half-time Bartlesville, which is 60 miles away. My daughter's getting her doctorate, going to be working kind of in Washington University, St. Louis here in a few months. She's married. It's the cognition in the elderly, and I call it just a bugger, the hippopotamus gland in your brain. Just tell her she better hurry. But that's kind of her interest is, aging, cognition, studies.
That's so marvelous because I met your kids when they weren't toddlers, but they were youngsters, and now the thing, one's a chemical engineer for a major petroleum company, the other married, getting her PhD in a complicated topic, and it's like, holy moly, life goes on. And congratulations, that's great.
Oh, I knew there was going to be a crack coming about. Thank God for Becky.
All right. So, give me a fun fact. We like to play fun facts. Tell us something about Derek Hinton that people may not know or anticipate that's completely unrelated to background screening.
Let's see. Some people never. I work out every couple of days. That's something nobody would ever expect.
You're right. That's not apparent. You're right.
Exactly. I guess I know a lot more about World War II than I do employment screening. I don't know, since I'm 12 years old, World War II has just fascinated me, whether it be, specifically Pacific submarine campaign, a little bit of the German-Russian war, the Holocaust, the kind of the first-person escapes from prisoner of war camps, both in the Philippines and in Europe. So that's just something, and I thought you were going to say, yeah, there's libraries of stuff that you know more about than employment screening. Usually you're digging, you've got your best behavior on this.
Oh, Derek, right, come on. You pick on me more than I pick on you, so it all works out.
So that's World War II is probably I know a lot about World War II more than employment screening.
Have you been to the World War II Museum in New Orleans? And
I went a year ago, and it was okay. It's kind of fragmented in the different, but yeah, it was enjoyable. Sometimes I get so specialized that something general like this, but it was fun. With 3 buddies, and, drove. It was fun.
I remember at a PBS meeting in San Antonio, my wife and I got a car. We went out to the Texas Hill Country and went to a little town, got barbecue. And in the middle of this little town, really not much around, there was the Chester Nimitz Museum. Apparently, yes. Chester Nimitz was born there. And it was fascinating.
What is that, Fredericksburg, by any chance?
I think it was. You're right.
He's a Texas boy. He was
the Texas boy, and he was the admiral for the Pacific in World War II. It's just amazing. All right, so given your time in the industry and the fact that you have literally done everything and know everybody, right, what's your advice for a newcomer or someone who's been in the industry for a couple of years? What's your advice in terms of how to make it a career, how to maximize your career, how to get ahead? What would you tell people?
Well, you hit on it a little bit earlier when I was talking about the change. You don't have to spend $1 million on computers and all of that stuff. And you said, yeah, but you still got to make it work. I have what would you call it, a startup package for CRAs, kind of get them papered up, compliant. And this is for new entrants into the industry. And, and sometimes it worries me if they don't have, it's easy to get into the industry. It's hard to make it work. So, they're worried about compliance and, which is the best criminal record vendor and which is the best platform, all of this stuff, getting into the details, that's all an intellectual exercise until the first client hits. So, if you're thinking about doing it, how are you going to get clients? Are you going to have a niche, or are you a staffing firm and you've got some built-in possibilities? But it worries me, people were, trying to learn every law in every state and every jurisdiction. And it's an intellectual exercise until you get a client. How are you going to get clients? What's your niche? How are you going to do that? Because you'll never use all this other stuff without clients. So.
All right. Derek, great advice as always. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you. And before we sign off, I always want to give my guest the last word. So Derek Hinton, and this is one conversation where you get the last word. The floor is yours.
Before I go in and talk with Becky. Yeah. I've got a kind of a question, last word. You ought to do what we ought to do.
What's that?
We ought to put you on the other end of the microphone. You're the one with your experience, death penalty cases, your early days at ESR, the My Job, the Reference Pro. I think you're copping out. I would like to do this to you, or you pick somebody and do this. That's my last word.
Well, Derek, I'll tell you what, just because you're my buddy and I've known you for so long, I will do that at some point.
Okay.
I'll have someone interview me
We could set it up like a deposition.
right.
I could pitch on the spot. Or somebody else. You'd probably want somebody nice, or
And then we can also sell it as a sleep aid. So people who can't sleep and want something that will bore them to sleep, they can listen to me talk.
It would put anybody out of the industry asleep. People in the industry, not so much.
Well, Derek, I appreciate that. And look, I appreciate our time together. We covered a lot. I think we've barely scratched the surface. There's a lot more we could have talked about. But listen, folks, it's been a pleasure having you. And ladies and gentlemen, again, this has been Mr. Derek Hinton, the founder and the moving force behind CRA Zoom, a extremely valuable and proactive member of the screening industry since 1984. And truly a gentleman, and I mean a gentleman who has seen it all, done it all. And it's been a pleasure working with you all these years, and it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. All right. That was yet another wonderful conversation with a background screening pro. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update. And hey, if you got a moment, we'd love for you to leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. For more info or to catch up on past episodes, or to make suggestions or to suggest possible future guests, head over to our website. Once again, this is your host, Les Rosen, and it's been a pleasure to bring you another episode. See you on the next episode. Thanks.